You're watching TVP World's special coverage from the Globsec Forum in Prague, and joining me now is former political prisoner and Russian opposition leader Vladimir Kara-Murza. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Can I start with your personal experience in Russia? What is life like if you speak out against Vladimir Putin?
Well, I've been in Russian politics now for more than 25 years. It was at the end of 1999 that I came to work for Boris Nemtsov, who was a former deputy prime minister in Russia and who, under President Boris Yeltsin, and who then, when Vladimir Putin came to power, became the most prominent, the most effective, the most well-known leader of the democratic opposition to the Putin regime. And as you know, 10 years ago, Boris Nemtsov was murdered on Putin's orders directly in front of the Kremlin. So it happened so that I came into politics at the same time that Putin came to power, and so I sort of had a front seat view, if you will, of how this man, this former Soviet KGB officer, transformed our country, Russia, from the imperfect democracy that it was back in the 1990s to the perfect dictatorship that it is today, where speaking out against the government is a criminal offense. We have a record number of political prisoners in Russia today. In fact, we have more political prisoners in Russia alone today than there were in the whole of the Soviet Union. So that's 15 countries put together back in the mid-1980s. The latest figure we have from human rights groups is more than 3,000 people. That's only the known names. Having been inside the system, I can tell you there are so many people who are not on any list, who are not on anybody's radars. But even the publicly available figure is shocking. And you know, one of the first things Putin did when he came to power was silence independent media. This was his first target, but in the first 3 years of his rule, he shut down or took over every single independent television network. He then began rigging elections. He then expunged the real opposition from parliament, abolished elections for regional governors, began forcefully dispersing peaceful demonstrations, and so on and so forth. But you know, for so many years, while Putin was doing this inside our country, he was still welcomed by so many Western leaders who, you know, would be willing to shake his hand, invite him for international summits, trade with him, buy oil and gas, look into his eyes, see his soul, push reset buttons, and so on. And I believe that this policy of enabling, of appeasement, if you will, on the part of so many Western countries for so many years of Putin's rule, contributed a great deal to the situation we face today, where we have the largest military conflict on European soil since the end of the Second World War, a conflict that has been waged by Vladimir Putin's regime against Ukraine. And one directly led into another, because as we know from the history of Russia, internal repression and external aggression are always two sides of the same coin. When you have a regime that disrespects the rights of its own people, it is not going to respect the borders of its neighbors.
For you personally, you were a political prisoner, as I mentioned, literally sent to Siberia. What was that like?
Well, I was arrested for publicly denouncing the war in Ukraine. That's a criminal offense in our country now. The same week Putin invaded Ukraine, a full-scale invasion back in February of 2022, he rubber-stamped these new laws, so-called laws, that made it a criminal offense, punishable by many years in prison, not only to speak out against the war in Ukraine, but even to talk about it, to give the facts about it, even to call it a war. That is a criminal offense. And so they waited for a few weeks for people who wanted to leave, because it's easier for the Kremlin when its political opponents just leave the country, so they don't have to deal with the arrests and the trials and everything else. But for me, it's always been a question of principle that a politician has to stay in his or her own country. A Russian politician has to be in Russia. I've always felt this way because, you know, I think politicians do have a certain level of responsibility towards our fellow citizens that, frankly, surpasses any considerations of personal safety or personal comfort. What moral right would I have to call on my fellow Russian citizens to stand up to Putin's dictatorship if I did not do it myself? So I chose to stay, as did so many other of my friends and colleagues, and I was arrested in April of 2022, about 6 weeks into the full-scale invasion. And then the criminal charges just kept coming and coming. So first it was spreading deliberately false information about the armed forces of the Russian Federation. That's Kremlin speak for speaking out against the war in Ukraine. Then my second charge was cooperating with an undesirable organization. Again, that's Kremlin speak. The reality was that I co-organized the annual conference of political prisoners in Moscow together with Memorial, Human Rights Center, and the Sakharov Museum. And then finally, the third and the biggest charge was quote-unquote high treason. And my 3 counts of high treason were 3 public speeches I made against the Putin regime, against the war in Ukraine, against political repression and political assassinations in Russia. And, you know, we'd really have to go back to Stalin's time to see a situation when public statements against the government would be equated to treason. And this is what dictatorships do. Well, we haven't had this situation in our country for a long time. And so my sentence was 25 years. Again, the highest sentence, the longest sentence for a political prisoner in Russia since the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953. And according to our national traditions, yes, I was sent to Siberia, Western Siberia, Omsk. It's a large city, 1 million plus, and it's also a city of prisons. There are 5 or 6 prisons in that city alone, and Omsk has been a place that has held political prisoners ever since the times of the Russian Empire. Some of the Decembrists were sent to prison there. Fyodor Dostoevsky was in prison in Omsk. In fact, his very well-known book, Letters from the Dead House, that's based on his experience in Omsk, where, by the way, he described how he interacted with the Polish nobility, who were also imprisoned in Omsk after one of the many uprisings against Russian imperial rule. And of course, in Soviet communist times, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, for example, was in prison in Omsk when he was on his way to Kazakhstan. So it is an old tradition. And because I'm a political prisoner, you know, ever since Soviet times, political prisoners who are considered to be particularly dangerous from the point of view of the regime are kept in total isolation, in solitary confinement. This is how Alexei Navalny was held. This is how I was held. So I was placed in a maximum security wing of the strict regime prison in Omsk. Solitary confinement, a small cell about 3 meters by 4. Just 4 walls, a small window under the ceiling with metal bars. Your bunk bed gets attached to the wall at 5 o'clock in the morning with a wake-up call, and then you can't take it down again until 9 in the evening. And for the entire day, essentially all you can do is just walk around in a small circle in that cell. They don't let you write. They only give you paper and pen for 1.5 hours a day, then they take it away again. I could have 2 books with me, and that was it. There was nothing to do. There was nowhere to go. There was no one to speak to. And I understand now why, according to international law, according to United Nations rules, solitary confinement for more than 15 days is considered to be a form of torture. Because, you know, when a human being is just completely deprived of any human contact, well, you start going crazy. That's the simplest way I can put it, and it takes a lot of effort to maintain one's sanity. The most difficult thing, and this is, again, this takes us back to Soviet-era practices. I was not allowed to speak to my family. I was not allowed to call my wife. I was not allowed to call my kids. This is a Soviet practice where they seek to punish not just the political opponent, but the family too. The family has to be made to suffer. I remember the one phone call I got back home from Omsk, from Siberia. It was a 15-minute call, and I have 3 children, so my wife had to literally stand on the other side with a stopwatch and see that each child gets no more than 5 minutes on the phone with their father, then she would have to physically take the phone away and pass it to the next one. This is torture for the family, and they do this on purpose. And, you know, I have to be honest with you, I did not think I would ever get out of that prison in Siberia. I thought that that's where my life was going to end. But last August, there was this miracle of the International Prisoner Exchange, which was facilitated by 8 countries acting together, including Poland, that released a Russian military intelligence officer who posed as a Spanish journalist who was imprisoned in Poland for espionage. And that exchange was a miracle. That's the only way I can put it. And I think the most powerful message sent by Western democracies in that prisoner exchange was that Western countries insisted that the exchange include not only their own citizens held hostage, you know, in Putin's prisons, but also Russian political prisoners. This was the first exchange of this kind in nearly 4 decades. And by doing this, Western countries sent a really powerful message. First of all, a very powerful message of support and solidarity with all those Russians inside Russia who do not support Putin, who do not support the war in Ukraine. But also they sent a very clear message to the Kremlin that they know who the real criminals are. They know that the real criminals are those people inside the Kremlin walls who have started this war of aggression in Ukraine, not those of us who are in prison because we had opposed it.
And let's talk about the Kremlin. Given your experiences at the hands of Vladimir Putin, we've seen these peace talks between officials in the Middle East. We've seen them in Istanbul, and every time it's felt like we're back at square one. Do you believe that Vladimir Putin is serious about peace?
Well, of course not. And frankly, I don't see how anybody in the West can even think like this. I mean, Vladimir Putin's the one who started this war. Ukraine presented no threat to Russia. There were no national interests, and there are no national interests of the Russian Federation involved in the war in Ukraine. This is the decision of the dictatorial, unelected, autocratic regime by Vladimir Putin. I mean, this is his mindset, right? He's a former Soviet KGB officer. He dreams of the quote-unquote lost glory of the Soviet Empire. He nostalgizes for periods of Joseph Stalin or Yuri Andropov. This is who this man is. I mean, remember, one of the first things Putin did when he became president of Russia 25 years ago was to reinstate the Stalin-era Soviet national anthem as national anthem of the Russian Federation. Now, in Russia, symbols are important, and Putin could not have chosen a more potent symbol to show the direction of his future rule, and this is what he's doing. And of course, he's not interested in peace. I mean, look, for as long as this man has been in power, he has continued to kill and kill and kill. He's killed people inside of Russia. You know, he's murdered two of his main political opponents, Boris Nemtsov and Alexei Navalny. He's killed people outside of Russia, in Georgia, in Ukraine the first time with the annexation of Crimea and the incursion into eastern Ukraine in 2014, in Syria where he intervened on the side of the dictator Assad, and of course with a full-scale invasion back in 2022. For as long as Vladimir Putin stays in power, there will be wars. For as long as Vladimir Putin stays in power, there will not be peace, not just in Ukraine, but in Europe as a whole. Russia is the largest country in Europe. Russia is the largest country in the world. What happens in Russia affects everybody. And for as long as Russia has a regime that is repressive towards its own people, it is always going to be aggressive towards its neighbors. The only way we could ensure long-lasting peace, security, and stability on the European continent is through a democratic Russia. Once there is a normal, legitimate, democratically elected government in Russia that would respect both its own laws and its own constitution and the civilized norms of international behavior. This is the only way to make peace in Europe.
So what is Donald Trump's thinking then by effectively giving Vladimir Putin the benefit of the doubt so far? If Vladimir Putin is not thinking of peace, is not capable of peace, is not open to peace, then why does President Trump keep talking about these negotiations as if there's two people like us sitting across a table willing to talk?
Well, because I think Donald Trump really likes Vladimir Putin, and that was apparent also in his first term. When everybody remembers his Donald Trump's behavior at the Helsinki summit, for example, and how he was really deferential to Putin. And I remember Senator John McCain, God rest his soul, who was one of the most principled, one of the most powerful voices in the American Congress when it came to issues of democracy, when it came to issues of human rights, when it came to Putin's Russia. I remember the comment Senator John McCain made at President Trump's performance with Putin in Helsinki when he said that never before had an American president so debased himself before a foreign dictator. But Helsinki was nothing compared to what we've seen in the current Trump term. I mean, we've seen, Mr. Trump publicly invite Putin back into the G8. We've seen the United States of America side with Putin's Russia, with Belarus and other dictatorships at the United Nations General Assembly in voting against the resolution condemning the aggression of Ukraine. We've seen Donald Trump effectively, publicly, several times blaming Ukraine for this war, when it was Ukraine that was attacked by Putin's regime. And it wasn't just words. I mean, remember back in March when the Trump administration paused security and military assistance to Ukraine, including intelligence sharing, leaving Ukraine for several days essentially defenseless against Russian missile and drone attacks, and many people died during that so-called pause, including civilians. And of course, everything that Mr. Trump has been doing in terms of dismantling, destroying the whole system of international democracy and human rights assistance, destroying the system of U.S. international broadcasting. That was so important for countries like Poland, for countries like Russia during the Cold War, when these radio stations, like Voice of America or Radio Free Europe, allowed millions of people inside the communist bloc behind the Iron Curtain to actually know the truth about what's going on. And Donald Trump just destroyed this system completely. I mean, a few weeks ago, Margarita Simonyan, who's the head of RT, the main Kremlin propaganda television network, she was on a Russian state TV show, and she was just gloating about this. She said, for years and years, for decades, there was nothing we could do with these radio stations, and now the Americans are just killing them off themselves. This is awesome. I think what Donald Trump is doing is a deliberate policy of enabling towards Vladimir Putin. I think this is despicable, I think this is damaging, and I think this is very shameful. And I think this administration will not go down too well in the history of American foreign policy.
Very briefly, because we're running out of time, but can you see Russia being a functioning Western democracy at some point, let's say in the next 2 decades?
I not only can, I do see it, and in fact I have absolutely no doubt that Russia is just as capable of being a functioning liberal democracy as is Poland, as is Germany, as is Spain, as are so many countries that once were dictatorships and now today are functioning liberal democracy. You know, I totally reject the so-called argument that some people put forward that, you know, there are countries or nations or peoples that are just not compatible with democracy. That's an absolute travesty to suggest that. That essentially is a racist argument. President Ronald Reagan, in his famous Westminster Address in 1982, said that it is cultural condescension or worse to suggest that there's any people on this planet who would voluntarily choose dictatorship over democracy. There's no reason that Russia cannot be a democracy. We've had democracy several times in our history. I'm old enough to remember what it was like to have free elections, independent media, political pluralism in Russia. And, you know, there is a whole generation now of people in our country who grew up under the Putin dictatorship and who are not happy with the way things are. Remember last year in 2024, in the midst of our so-called presidential election, when it was just Putin and a couple of clowns on the ballot and, you know, total enforced unanimity, suddenly there was one guy, a lawyer, a former member of parliament named Boris Nadezhdin, who announced that he was running as the anti-war candidate. He said he's against the war in Ukraine and he was going to stop it on day one. And the public response was just incredible. Suddenly, you saw these hours-long lines of people form all over the country, in the middle of the Russian winter, of people who stood at Nadezhdin's campaign offices waiting to sign nomination papers to get him on the ballot. It was so important to see this because in a matter of just a few days, the Putin propaganda image that everybody in Russia supports the regime and the war fell apart. Because you can rig election results, which they do. You can fix opinion polls numbers, which they do. But there's nothing you can do to hide the sight of hundreds of thousands of people literally voting with their feet for the anti-war candidate. So many of these people were young. And so I have absolutely no doubt in the democratic future of Russia. I think that day will come much sooner than many people expect today. And a democratic Russia is the only sure guarantee of peace, security, and stability on the European continent. A democratic Russia is the only sure guarantee of that Europe whole, free, and at peace that we all want to see. And it is in all of our interests to make sure that this day comes a little faster.
Former political prisoner and Russian opposition leader Vladimir Kara-Murza, thank you so much again for your time.
Thank you so much for your invitation.
And thank you for watching this exclusive interview here from the GlobSec Forum. Do stay with us here on TVP World. I'm Dahmen. Goodbye for now.